Barak's generous offer. If you look at the fourth picture, that's the West Bank. The orange, gold, Palestine, white, Israel. Borders and in between. Taba, supposedly the greatest offer to the Palestinians. Sharon on a good day. He was feeling very generous. We just don't understand why the Palestinians don't accept their freedom when offered. Do I need to explain it now? Well, brown is Palestine. White is Israel. Blue triangles, Israeli settlements, so that eventually brown and blue, or brown and purple. They're the same maps, give or take. This is a separation wall, Gush Shalom, this is some years ago, showing where it was going and where it would go. And again, if it's a security wall, it could be inside Israel, but it's not. And why on the other side? Maybe they want to protect Jordan from the Palestinians too. It's very complicated. But it's the same map with a wall around it now. 2006, yellow Palestine, white Israel. 2007, (2008), oh, 1940s. This is what became Israel. The West Bank is in white. These are Palestinian villages that were destroyed when the Palestinians were cleansed from what became Israel. And this is a map of Jewish identity that we don't think about and we don't see. Again, the West Bank. So here are two maps of Jewish identity. And some Israelis, some Israeli architects who wrote the book, A Civilian Occupation, think that what's happening in the West Bank, the movement of Palestinians toward the Jordan River and the settlements there, are really a continuation of the settlement of the interior of Israel once the Palestinians were cleansed. And that it's a movement of settling, which is continuing, rather than a new phase or something different. Now, I live in the United States in a settler state, and so do you. I love visiting forts. Forts are the cutting edge of settlement, aren't they? And in my country, there are people on reservations, and in your country too. So Israel's not the only settler state, but it is a settler state. Yes, the Holocaust. But by the way, if you're interested, this is something in the Holocaust class. I know I'm not teaching it today, but it's these numbers. You wonder where these numbers come from and why they're there. They come because IBM tabulated the Holocaust. I don't know how many of you have read the book, IBM and the Holocaust. It was the first use of the computer, the Hollerith machine. IBM made its money through computerizing two systems, the Social Security system in the United States and the Nazi system, especially the concentration and death camps. And the number is on the forearm because it used to be on the back or whatever, but so many bodies stacked up on one another, it was hard to see it. So the Holocaust, yes, it happened. It's a trauma. It is a deep part of Jewish history. But these other maps as well. Now we could extend the maps. We could put an American flag there. That's part of Jewish identity too, but also a Canadian flag. Mahatma Gandhi, not Jewish. But he was surrounded by Jews. There's a very interesting book titled Gandhi's Jewish Friends. And Gandhi wrote a letter on every subject in world history, and that's why his writings, he didn't write but a book or so, are 100 volumes. Trying to get them from my center. In 1938, he wrote a letter to the German Jews. And he said, you know, it's unbelievably difficult for you, but you are citizens of Germany. You must stand up for your citizenship and for your rights. Nonviolent struggle. Some of you will be imprisoned, some of you will die, but in the end, Germans will recognize your humanity and you will be accepted. Gandhi was wrong. Gandhi did not understand European violence in Europe. A second part of his letter was about the Jewish settlers in Palestine. He said, you're welcome to live anywhere in the world. But if you try to create a state and expel the Arabs of Palestine, you will be seen as colonialists and imperialists. Martin Buber is a Jew, or was, one of the great Jews of the 20th century. Viennese Jew, lived in Germany, expelled in 1938, went to Jerusalem, and argued for a binational state. He was a homeland spiritual Zionist. He believed in a collective living in Palestine alongside an Arab collective because Jews needed to be rerouted in the land to redevelop spoken Hebrew, education, kibbutz, particularity, but giving that to the world universally. He writes to Gandhi and says, you do not understand the violence of the Nazis. Buber was right. And he says to Gandhi about settlements in Palestine among Jews, if we create a state, you're right, we will be correctly seen as colonialists and imperialists, but we have no desire to do that. Martin Buber, one of the most famous Jews of the 20th century, was against the establishment of the State of Israel. But yet he was a Zionist, a cultural or homeland Zionist. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor who gave his life trying to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace and costly grace. Cheap grace was just, I'm blessed by God, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm saved. Costly grace meant suffering, doing justice. Gandhi said to his people, burn your British clothes. When you burn them, you burn their shame. You burn your shame. What do we Jews have to burn? With regard to Bonhoeffer, it's become pretty easy to be Jewish. Cheap Jewishness. The Jewishness that is high mobility, high status, pure innocence. What is costly Jewishness? Edward Said. He's already ill here, but you can see handsome, a prince, and he knew it. Palestinian. It's interesting, most Palestinians see their struggle as universal against a violent Jewish particularity, but it's not. It's a particularity, too, and a very beautiful one at times. Said spent his whole lifetime writing against essentialism, against any fixed identity. He didn't think Palestine was overly important, but Palestinians had a right to be free. But with Oslo, when that was signed by Arafat, you'll notice if you follow Edward Said's career, he went ballistic. He wrote more than ever. He was furious. He couldn't contain his anger. And I want to tell you why, in my view. He thought Palestinians were better than that. He thought Palestinians were exceptional. He was mourning that loss, as many Jews do, with reference to Jewishness. Noam Chomsky. I'm often overshadowed when I tour, and certainly when I was in London a few weeks ago, there's Chomsky, maybe for his last tour of England. And he is decking out the halls, and at all the universities they have these rooms with big screens that are projecting it, and I'm trying to get 50 people to hear me. And he deserved it, no problem. And one of the reasons he gets thousands is because he's seen as a universal figure, but that's a mistake. If you look at Chomsky's background, born and raised in a totally Jewish family, and he is a Zionist. Never talks about it, rarely does. He's a homeland Zionist. And in a new book coming out, there's an interview with him which talks about that. So these universal figures, Edward Said and Noam Chomsky, are very particular. And the beautiful Hannah Arendt with the cigarette and everything. Hannah Arendt went to the Eichmann trial, most of you would know this story, and wrote a series of articles which later became a book talking about Eichmann and the banality of evil. Well, if you want to ever see a Jewish figure vilified, read the literature that responded to Hannah Arendt's book. I can identify with it very much. But then look back. Most of her writings, and there's a new edition of her Jewish writings, most of her writing is about Jews. And she was expelled from Germany. She had to flee the Nazis, helped Jewish refugees when she came to America, and worked with Judah Magnus, who was another homeland spiritual Zionist and the first president of Hebrew University. Not a marginal Jew at all. He was also against the formation of a Jewish state. And he spent his last years in Washington lobbying Secretary of State Marshall and President Harry Truman not to recognize a state of Israel. In fact, he asked President Truman to land American troops in Jerusalem to keep Palestine together. Now, those of you who are against American interventionism, I'm with you, but that would be a good one. Well, Hannah Arendt wrote, if you want to see prophetic writing about what would happen if Israel was created, look at her writing in 1947 and 1948. It's in the Jewish writings. It's available now. She says, among other things, she has 3 points. One, if Israel becomes a state, they will have to expel Palestinians, and there will be an eternal war in the Middle East. Second, if Israel becomes a state and expels Palestinians, the state will have to be militarized to fight that endless war. And therefore, the values that would come from the homeland sense of Zionism would be consumed in warfare. And then third, if Israel became a state, expelled the Palestinians, became militarized, the Jewish diaspora would become militarized. And in the end, no dissent would be tolerated. Oh, unknown. Oren Ben-Dor. Met him in Boston at a one-state conference, the first one-state conference in the United States. He's a philosopher of law at the University of Southampton in the UK. Just visited him there. One of the most sensitive men I've ever met. He, with 750 to 1 million other Israelis, have left Israel permanently. He left many years ago. And although each Israeli that leaves has their own personal story, as a collective we have to ask why such a huge percentage of the population lives outside permanently. After all, if the idea is we were exiled and now we've returned to the land, there's a new exile, the Israeli diaspora. And although some of those Israelis who had left used to yell at me, this is years ago, now they come up to me and ask me for help because they want a way out. Why are these Israelis in exile? They couldn't do it anymore. That's what I think. A lot of them had done it, what they were told to do by the state, but they couldn't do it. Well, for those of you who don't think I know why there's a state, my teacher was Richard Rubenstein, who's a hawk on Israel. And in 1966, he wrote the book after Auschwitz. There's my edition, $2.45. And Rubenstein asked the question, where was God at Auschwitz? Our protector, the God who had said, "You are my people, I will be with you." Where was God at Auschwitz? Rubenstein said, God wasn't. The covenant, which has two sides, the people have to do what God has to do. God didn't, we're done. He says it a little more intellectually, but that's what I got when I was 18 and sitting there. By the way, when Rubenstein announced this, he didn't then give you a hug, like we're supposed to do in America as teachers. He was not a huggy. He just announced it, left the room, and I sat there at my desk, you know. He was feeling very generous. We just don't understand why the Palestinians don't accept their freedom when offered. Do I need to explain it now? Well, brown is Palestine. White is Israel. Blue triangles, Israeli settlements. So that eventually, brown and blue, or brown and purple. They're the same maps, give or take. Barak's generous offer. If you look at the fourth picture, that's the West Bank. The orange, gold, Palestine, white, Israel. Borders and in between. Taba, supposedly the greatest offer to the Palestinians. Sharon on a good day. Again, the West Bank. So here are two maps of Jewish identity. And some Israelis, some Israeli architects who wrote the book, A Civilian Occupation, think that what's happening in the West Bank, the movement of Palestinians toward the Jordan River and the settlements there, are really a continuation of the settlement of the interior of Israel once the Palestinians were cleansed. And that it's a movement of settling. 2008. Oh, 1940s. This is what became Israel. The West Bank is in white. These are Palestinian villages that were destroyed when the Palestinians were cleansed from what became Israel. And this is a map of Jewish identity that we don't think about and we don't see. This is a separation wall, Gush Shalom, this is some years ago, showing where it was going and where it would go. And again, if it's a security wall, it could be inside Israel, but it's not. And why on the other side? Maybe they want to protect Jordan from the Palestinians too. It's very complicated. But it's the same map with a wall around it now. 2006, yellow Palestine, white Israel. 2007,